We ask that you help us share the speaker's point of view and share yours as well. So please be sure to follow us on Instagram and at CHLI. After the panel discussion, there will be time for questions and answers. The discussion, including questions and answers, are being live streamed through our YouTube channel at the CHLI. The discussion is also recorded, so you can go back to view the program and share it with others. Now to kick off the program, I'll pass it on to the CHL President and CEO, Marianne Gomez-Orta.
All right, thank you everyone. Thank you for being here. Again, the Congressional Hispanic Leadership Institute, for those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, we're the premier organization. I'm going to fix this little microphone here for myself because I'm the shorter one here too. It's a premier organization founded by members of Congress to advance the Hispanic community's progress with a focus on social responsibility and global competitiveness. Founded in 2003, CHLI is a bicameral, bipartisan nonprofit. We're the only bipartisan and bicameral Hispanic-led and Hispanic-serving institute here in Washington, D.C. We are dedicated to fostering a broad awareness of the diversity of thought, heritage, interests, and views of Americans of Hispanic and Portuguese heritage. I would like to recognize a few people here who are joining us. First off, I want to thank our team, Bree, who you just met, as well as Angela, Nicole, Tia, Maite, Mercy, Andres, Sophia, and Wesha, Bruce, and Gabriel. Thank you so much for helping us with the program. Also, as you know, these programs could not be possible without our corporate sponsors. So the Public Policy Briefing Series is year-round. Our sponsors are Amazon, Capital One, Chevron, Dell Technologies, Dominion Energy, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Green Hills Software. Please join me in a round of applause for our sponsors. Our briefing series provides a platform for in-depth dialogue on current public policy issues that affect the U.S. Hispanic communities as well as the Portuguese communities. These are briefings to educate and inform members of Congress and their staff and the Hispanic community across the country. As Bree mentioned at the beginning, this is being live streamed and recorded and will be also available after the program. Today's topic of discussion is cybersecurity, safeguarding, critical infrastructure, and innovation. Before we get into today's discussion, I would like to bring up to the podium our host here from Florida International University, Carlos Becerra, who is the Associate Vice President of Government Relations for Florida International University here in DC, what we call, so I think if we were at the university and at the campus, he would probably be like the dean of the DC campus. Right, Carlos?
Right. We also like to refer to ourselves as Miami's Embassy in Washington, D.C. Obviously, we're proud to be Miami's public research university. Excited to welcome our great partners, CHLI, and our great panelists here today. Glad to see University of Maryland on the deck, as many of our faculty members have collaborated over the years. Welcome to FIU in D.C. We, like CHLI, are committed to opening the doors of future leaders on the Hill and all throughout the Capitol. Excited to see you'll meet one of our cybersecurity faculty members a little bit later. Back in this corner, Dr. Todd Crowell is, along with some other faculty, is leading a major environment summit this week. So you're more than welcome to come back and tune into that beginning tomorrow. But we're excited to continue collaborating with CHLI. Excited about today's dialogue, obviously, when it comes to the university and a lot of investments from the federal government and the private sector on AI and cybersecurity related research and how we're engaged with the corporate sector. So I think we're all looking forward to learn. Special shout out, we have a group of FIU students that are also in town visiting for a Future of AI seminar. So no pressure. We expect your questions to be the best. But with that said, thank you, Marianne, and thank you, CHLI.
All right. Thank you again, Carlos. So I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator, and then he will take it from there. Aaron Arriaga is a senior consultant with Heron Associates, Inc. He has strategic advice and mission support as part of his portfolio for the international programs within the Program Executive Office for Unmanned and small combatants at the Naval Sea Systems Command, which I guess is called NAVSEA, right? Of the U.S. Department of Defense. Prior to this, he served as a Biden administration political appointee at the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. His experience has largely been centered around national security, foreign affairs, and digital policy. Aaron graduated from the University of Florida, the other Florida campus, with a bachelor's degree in political science. Aaron is also an alum of the CHLI Global Leaders Program. He's class of 2021 and is a proud Guatemalan American from Miami. So join me in a round of applause for Aaron, and he will take it over from here. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you, Marianne. And thank you to those attending the program today. It's a pleasure to be here today as we discuss the importance of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is essential for protecting critical infrastructure, businesses, and national security from cyber threats. It also enables innovation in technologies like AI and the internet. For the Hispanic community, understanding cybersecurity is crucial for digital access and safeguarding against evolving risk. By building this knowledge, individuals can protect their own security, support business growth, and contribute to national security while helping bridge the digital divide. Now, please help me welcome our panelists. To the panel, I'd like to introduce each and every one of you. So I'll be starting to my right here with Dr. David Mussington. Dr. David Mussington is a professor of practice at the University of Maryland, College Park. He returned to this role in January of 2025, following an appointed position within the Biden-Harris administration as Executive Assistant Director for Infrastructure Security at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Yes, that is a very long title, I know. His areas of expertise include critical infrastructure cybersecurity and resilience, cyber defense, artificial intelligence governance and technology policy, as well as counterterrorism. He holds BA and MA degrees in economics and political science from the University of Toronto and a PhD in political science from Carleton University. He has done postdoctoral work at Harvard University's Belfer Center and the UK International Institute for Strategic Studies. Dr. Mussington has also worked in the Obama administration as a senior advisor for cyber policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And if I add, he is also my former boss. So if it seems like I'm giving him any special treatment, I'm not. David, thank you for being here. Next up on the panel is Jeff Browning. Jeff is the Director of Global Government Affairs and Public Policy for ServiceNow, a company that supports cybersecurity, IT auditability, AI adoption, and modernization needs at nearly 90% of Fortune 500 companies and every U.S. cabinet agency. He has been in his role for approximately 4 years and holds a BA in political science from Loyola University. His areas of expertise include cybersecurity, AI, IT cost oversight, foreign affairs, appropriations, and government modernization. Before joining ServiceNow, Jeff worked on the Hill for 11 years for Representatives Catherine Clark, Anna Eshoo, Barney Frank, and Jim McGovern, and spent 2 years working on Geneva Convention issues. He is the founder of Congressional Record, an event at the Capitol where bipartisan members of Congress perform music together, co-hosted by the Grammys and the Congressional Musicians Caucus. Jeff, welcome. And lastly, but not least, John Werther. John is the Vice President of Government Relations at Green Hills Software and has been with them for 23 years. He is an expert in embedded real-time software, having worked across major Department of Defense avionics and weapons system programs. John is a 1985 graduate of the University of Maryland in finance and accounting and has been in leadership positions in the embedded industry for over 36 years. His expertise and experience over that time in major C5ISR programs includes work with the Department of Defense and combat command components across land, sea, and air domains. He has written on military veteronics and presented across many military and aerospace events. His cradle-to-grave work with military programs included model-based architecture, design, software development, deployment, and sustainment. John, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, let's get started with the discussion. I'm going to ask each panelist a specific question based on their expertise. Other panelists are encouraged to add their points of view. And to kick us off, Dr. David Mussington. So Dr. Mussington, what do you consider the most important cybersecurity issues confronting the United States at present?
So first, thanks, Aaron. Thanks, everyone, for the stage. Since I left CISA 3 months ago, I've sort of stayed in my basement office and been a bit antisocial, so it's great to get out and talk to people again, especially in advance of confronting my students in about 6 months. I'm on kind of sabbatical until September. The one thing about audiences like this is it emphasizes how important it is to translate academic or abstract concerns about risk into real facts that can reach people. So I'll start off at the 20,000 foot level and I'll try and get more detail after that. To directly answer the question, the biggest threats that concern me in terms of cybersecurity are nation-state threats to U.S. critical infrastructure. By nation-states, I'll name the same four that we named when I was in the Biden-Harris administration, which is the Russian Federation, Iran, North Korea, and most importantly, the People's Republic of China. In the latter case, there's a couple of intrusion sets or campaign names that I want to put on the table right away. Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon, which are nation-state cyber threat campaigns designed to hold hostage U.S. critical infrastructure for future manipulation. Not just the energy sector, not just the telecommunications sector, not just the water and wastewater treatment sector, not just transportation, not just public sector authorities like schools or water systems or colleges and universities. All of the above have been targeted for persistent access with potential control exercised by People's Republic of China, Ministry of State Security, or People's Liberation Army elements and proxies. That is the guiding chronic threat to U.S. critical infrastructure for me in the cyber domain. I'll end by just saying that the techniques and tools that those actors use are available in the black and gray market to criminals. So what you have is the capability, an expanded capability, to exploit critical infrastructure at scale in the context of vulnerabilities that have existed for years that are not patched. So it's not as if these people have to be geniuses. They don't. What happens is we leave vulnerabilities available for exploitation to our own detriment, and that is the biggest threat. If you add that to nation-state threat actors with a reason to want to undermine our security, we're in a sense creating a free fire zone for people to take advantage of us at times of their choosing. That's how I'll start.
Thank you, David. Jeff, this next question is for you. Could you share some of the cyber threats that affect your industry today?
Sure. Thanks, Aaron. By the way, it's an honor to be here with people who I've only ever known by reputation before, so I appreciate the chance to be here speaking with you all. So as mentioned, ServiceNow, we support nearly 90% of Fortune 500 companies, including across a variety of sectors, utilities, healthcare, finance, and government. So I think we have a pretty good purview on a lot of the trends that we observe across those areas. So rather than just our sector, I think I'd offer some thoughts on them generally. First of all, I would absolutely echo Dr. Mussington's point that advanced persistent threats, or APTs in cybersecurity parlance, are becoming more sophisticated and persistent, and that the line between cyber infrastructure and people's lives is perhaps thinner than we realize. There are hospital systems that have had ransomware attacks that have essentially shut down hospital operations, where I had a family member who went and said that the only people at the hospital who could help out were nurses who'd been there since everything was on paper and remembered what it was like. So we really are dependent on a lot of this infrastructure before you even get to talking about power, water, and utilities, things that we perhaps take for granted every day. So nation-state actors with resources are putting a lot of resources into developing the sophistication of their tactics, techniques, and procedures. And it is absolutely vital for organizations to have structures and mechanisms in place to respond to threats quickly, to respond to vulnerabilities quickly once they become known. One thing I'd maybe add is that the human element is also a really critical one to consider. In addition to responding to vulnerabilities, it's also important to provide training to employees for large organizations, whether it's the U.S. Congress, whether it's a federal agency, whether it's a Fortune 500 or a small business. When you read about recent breaches, some of them were because of a human factor. It could be, sure, because someone clicked a link in an email, or it could be something more sophisticated. Someone received a phone call that sounded familiar, because it's actually pretty easy to generate those things with artificial intelligence. LinkedIn is another example I'd share. Oversharing on LinkedIn can result in people being perhaps targeted off LinkedIn in all kinds of other ways. Perhaps people may reach out with paid consulting gigs, for example, that aren't actually paid consulting gigs. They're only meant to extract information from the inside of an organization. So I think each of us has a responsibility to be diligent, and as leaders here in Washington who are supporting policies, I think all of those things and approaches are definitely threads worth pulling and supporting at scale.
Thank you, Jeff. John, for our next question, what are the most common security challenges you face when working with embedded systems, and how do you address them?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I also want to thank CHLI for the event and Janice Fuentes for inviting me here today. I really appreciate it. It's a great opportunity to really introduce you to some of the way we think about this challenge set in embedded systems. So before I address the security challenges, I want to just quickly ask, who here came here on an airplane? Raise your hand. Anybody fly in? So always remember, 20-some years ago when I had my interview with my company, I was asked a question. John, how do you feel about software that's 99.999% reliable? And I'm thinking, that's pretty good, right? Wrong. It's not the right answer. Because if you think about 10,000 takeoffs and landings a day, you would never, society would never put up with software that was failing that much, right? So at Green Hills, we think about high assurance software. So before I address the security challenges, a couple points as follows. Critical infrastructure has two fundamental challenges right now, right? They have the fact that there's a cloud infrastructure in place, and then you have the embedded endpoints. And those endpoints can be very challenging in of themselves, because many of those systems were never designed from the ground up with security. Furthermore, you look at the cloud, and now suddenly you have this concept of introducing an internet connection to the critical infrastructure. And that can pose a lot of issues for remote users. By default, you're opening up the critical infrastructure for attack vectors, right? And I think both my colleagues here addressed some of those points. But the bottom line is, when you open up the internet, you introduce the idea of malicious actors getting involved. And so these actors can also obfuscate where they're hiding and make it look like the attack came from another place, you know, and those are real challenges. But the challenge for the critical infrastructure folks themselves is, you know, you have this valve, the internet, that you can open or close, and you have to really deal with what exposure your risk you're taking. But I think we acknowledge there are benefits to internet in terms of, you may have remote users. You can't send everyone out 1,000 miles in the field to fix something. So there are benefits to having that connectivity. And so how we address that, to answer the question, is Green Hills builds our software from the ground up with security in mind, and our software is built to protect at that nation-state threat level. Okay, so we are in systems, and I'll talk about this later, but you know, when you start thinking about a B1B, a B2, high assurance encryption systems, that's the world we're living. We're living in systems that cannot be hacked and cannot fail, or people die, or cost a lot of money. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, John. Jeff, this next one's for you. What can Congress and the administration do to improve cybersecurity across the federal government? Are there any policies already in the books that are under-implemented and that could possibly be strengthened?
Sure. So I think you made a really good point about endpoints. And when you think about a modern organization and what they have on their network, hardware and software, many organizations have hundreds of thousands of devices on their network with an IP address. So it could be a phone, it could be a laptop, it could be a printer, it could be a light switch, any one of these things that's on their network. And so it's really important to have an accurate, up-to-date inventory of what those things are, not only what the software and hardware is, but also how it's configured. In 2017, Congress passed one of my favorite statutes, which is called the Megabyte Act. So it's been on the books for about 8 years. and it required all federal agencies. Now, this is what a lot of Fortune 500s do. It's a widely acknowledged best practice, but what the Megabyte Act did is it required all agencies to create an up-to-date inventory of all the software they own and to use automated tools to keep that inventory up to date. Because when you think about it, agencies buy a lot of things, so you need to have some automation to keep that up to date. 8 years later, for a variety of reasons, a lot of agencies are still doing that manually on spreadsheets, which is a problem for a few reasons. One is it makes it difficult to measure the money that you're spending. If you can't actually see what those assets are, it makes it difficult for cost control. And two is it makes it difficult to take a proactive cybersecurity stance, because when you learn about a vulnerability, if you need to go through a spreadsheet and look manually at every asset on your network and how they're configured, and then sort of try to patch them manually, then you're not really moving at the speed of risk. Because as a lot of my colleagues here know, when these vulnerabilities become known, they can be exploited in minutes, if not seconds. So I would say that this is a thoroughly bipartisan bill when it passed, and there had support from both sides. There are a lot of things that Congress and the administration could do to help make sure that that happens. They could issue an M memo from OMB, for example. CISA has issued a lot of guidance on asset management in particular, and others. It's a pillar of the Zero Trust strategy, National Zero Trust strategy. Almost every cyber strategy under the sun talks about the importance of devices. And also the CISA CDM program, Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation. One of the core goals of this program for a long time was visibility of assets. I think there are a lot of conversations happening about the future of that program that are exciting, and that's definitely a goal that I think would be good to support.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff. A lot of good points made. John, critical infrastructure's connections to the internet are the root cause of many cyber attacks, leading to denial of service or outages. What can the industry, or Green Hills for that matter, recommend to mitigate risk caused by exposure to the internet?
So I thought about that one long and hard, and the answer became pretty simple. The answer, at the end of the day, make the underlying equipment invisible to the internet. And that may make you think, well, what does that mean? Make it simple. And I brought charts to hand out, but we have a solution for that. And really, when you have open source systems out there that are insecure and they're trying to be patched, you can't have that in an underlying critical infrastructure environment. So you have to eliminate that ability for someone to get to it through the internet. And I'm not going to talk guards today and things like that, but there are ways that you can eliminate that attack service and still give access to the internet, have your Windows and Linux. We have techniques where we can safeguard those capabilities from the insecure vulnerabilities that are out there. So I can go into that a little bit more afterwards, but for this answer, make the underlying equipment invisible to the internet.
Gotcha. Thank you, John.
Can I just respond to
Yeah,
that?
absolutely.
Totally agree with that insight about making attack surface less exploitable. I'm not sure how you make the private sector adopt your technique, however, if they don't want to. And one struggle that the United States has had for many years is varying levels of cybersecurity in different critical infrastructures and different parts of critical infrastructures. So even technical solutions that offer attack surface management, I suppose, in one place can have the net effect of revectoring attackers to someplace else. So the person who isn't protected ends up having 2 to 10 times as much bad guy incidents on still critical infrastructure. So whatever we do, we need a comprehensive solution that isn't just one critical infrastructure or 2 critical infrastructures.
Thank you, David. And this next question is actually for you. What would you say is the principal impediment to rapid and persistent improvements in U.S. critical infrastructure resilience?
So I think the answer to that question has changed over the last few years. I think 10 years ago, the answer was probably people weren't convinced that cybersecurity was that big a deal. I think that we took years to try and convince people, public sector, the public, government, that the bad guys, adversaries could actually penetrate critical infrastructures and do damage. And if people didn't think that damage was possible, they were willing to just let whatever was happening happen. I don't think that many people believe that anymore, but I think that's because we've had solar winds, colonial pipelines, and a few other celebrated incidents where critical infrastructure has been denied, where ransomware has restricted access to services, where people have suffered identity theft enabled by internet connectivity, so that the realities of the impact have become more real to people. So as those realities have become more real, the question is, why aren't we doing better? I think one reason we're not doing better is because while individual critical infrastructures may adopt protection, when they're connected together, they're often weaker because you're never as strong as you could be if you can't be aware of what your neighbor is doing with whom you're connected. So if they choose to underinvest in cybersecurity and resilience, and you invest a lot, then your investment is in a sense diluted by your neighbor's exploitability. I'll mention one other thing that CISA still publishes. The known exploited vulnerabilities list, which are persistent vulnerabilities of internet exposed systems and assets. Some of the items on that list are years old. That means there are vulnerabilities that are under active exploitation by nation states, by criminals, by insiders, by disgruntled people, by an alphabet soup of actors that can, again, undermine the efficacy of the investments you make in security. That accumulates, has scale. So if you've got 16 critical infrastructures, 8 or 9 of which are private sector owned, and you have an underinvestment in security because people are, in a sense, free riding on the security investments of their neighbors, across a society that can create an undermined security baseline where adversaries don't have to be very creative to have impact, where vulnerabilities remain unaddressed for years, and where if you are lucky enough to not be victimized by cyber threats, well, it's the dog that didn't bark. You have no private incentive to do anything more than what you're already doing. You know, when I used to teach a long time ago, I used to call that a public goods problem, where the investment, the private sector incentives to invest in security didn't accumulate to provide societal levels of cybersecurity and resilience that we all need as a collective. I think that's still true, and I think that's a principal impediment to rapid and persistent progress, because individual companies like Greenhill and other sort of good citizens who invest and deploy and operate best practices are less effective if others with whom they are connected do less.
Thank you, David. John, can you share some of the ways you support your customers in helping them to protect themselves and their data from cyber criminals?
Another great question, and following on with that comment, when others do less, that's a perfect segue to your question and my answer, which is that Green Hills provides the underlying technology and the guidance to provide companies that learning and that education and then the implementation using our IP to implement high assurance. So we're going to do a little history lesson because I like to try to create in your mind examples. Who remembers a concept or something called the Maginot Wall, or Maginot Line, excuse me? It's World War II. Some of the, yeah, okay, sorry. Who read about it? So if you do your history, you'll find out that that was something France built to deter the Germans from coming across the line. And so to put in your mind the idea that if some of these safeguards are supposedly out there, firewalls, intrusion detection systems, but if they're not built on a secure foundation, if they're built on sand, the house crumbles, right? You see it fall into the ocean. So think about Green Hills. What we're doing is we are building from the ground up capabilities that are high assurance. They've been formally mathematically proven. They mitigate covert channel, which is nation state type attacks where you can leak data. And again, we're not here to do a technical presentation, but our technology, I like to think of it as we're Captain America with the shield out there to provide that bulletproof capability out there. So, you know, our technology has been proven in use. It's deployed across many, many weapon systems, too many to mention here today, and it's been tested. If you don't believe me, you go to the National Vulnerability Database where you don't see vulnerabilities for Green Hills operating system. That goes back to 2008 when we did our original testing with National Security Agency. I can't talk about all the systems we're in, as you can imagine, but you can probably figure out the type of systems. As one captain said to me, it's going to be a really bad day if we have to use your stuff. But that's the type of world that I live in. So I hope that answers the question.
Maybe just also reflect on both of those points to say that software supply chain is really important here. Not only that you're getting things from good actors, but that you're tracking what goes into what you're using. CISA has done a lot of work in this area. A lot of the software that we use may have a lot of component parts. It's important to track what those parts are. And there are new standards that are coming online for categorizing that data, for being able to look at what the components parts are that go into the software that you're using. Those types of standards are important, and overall standards are important as well.
Just on that point, liability or accountability is also important as well, as in why should a software developer adhere to secure by design standards when they're designing software or systems? Do we make them, do we use the law to make them do it? Is it their reputation that they use? Or are they simply good citizens and great engineers with a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders and their customers? All those things. What happens if people don't adhere to those standards and something bad happens? How do we police adherence to good standards? I mean, I think society's been on a journey to make sure that we get continuous improvement in these areas, and sometimes we fall back, but pretty clear that if we emulate best practice adherence like Green Hills and others, we'll all be better off, but we can't be sure that that's the future we're going to have.
I want to make one correction too. When I said it's a bad, our software is running in such critical devices where, when I said deployed, I mean we're deployed in it to keep the world safe, meaning it's not hackable. So our systems are in very critical weapon systems technology that can't be hacked. So I just wanted to clear that, because I realized when I said the other word, I wanted to make sure that was clear. One statement I do want to make too is if you look at Christopher Wray's testimony from last year, he talked about some of the nation-state challenges, and and I quote here, China's hackers are positioning on American infrastructure in preparation to wreak havoc and cause real-world harm to American citizens' communities. If and when China decides the time has come to strike, they're not just focused on political and military targets. We can see from where they're positioning themselves that low blows are just a possibility in the event of conflict, and those low blows are part of China's plan. So that's the type of nation-state threat that we are facing here. Stop there.
Before you go on, I have to sort of amplify the point that was just made two ways. One, I think weapon systems, cybersecurity, and embedded systems is one whole domain that is probably much better than everything else. And that it is not the case that most of our water and wastewater systems and our pipelines are to the same level of sophistication and protection. If it was, we could have a different topic today. Rather, we have a real variation in the level of quality of cybersecurity and information assurance across different sectors, from public schools to police forces to city hall to utilities. That variation in interconnected systems allows attackers to exploit things. And that's what Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon, which is what Christopher Wray was talking about, are actually trying to do successfully, because we aren't evicting them as quickly as they are re-entering key systems and holding them hostage.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you for the valuable insights. A lot to think about. And I think it's a great segue for our next question. David, what is the best way to work with the private sector to ensure U.S. critical infrastructures are resilient against a dynamic threat environment?
So I think the first thing is to sort of know the private sector in terms of varying quality of both risk awareness that they have and how well equipped they are to deal with the risks on their own. The last thing that companies want is for the federal government to sort of show up and help them do something that they're doing already. From that, I think you can go to the commonplace acknowledgement that well-resourced companies, big banks, big energy companies, big utilities that have very sophisticated cybersecurity programs are probably not the most in need of federal assistance. Now so maybe that's taking big platform service providers off the table. What about the water system in a small town? What about City Hall? What about DMVs? What about schools? Those entities probably need more assistance both from the private sector, from academia, and from federal government agencies like CISA and sector risk management agencies, because they face threats like ransomware that they may not be used to. They may not have the skills to address them. So I think that once you partition the risk landscape that way, the federal government and government can maybe broker partnerships between private technical companies. I think threat information providers like Mandiant and others, I pick on them because they're now owned by somebody else, where the skills are in the private sector, and help the public sector better understand the services that are available. Obviously, if it's a cyber incident with scale of national importance, CISA and agencies like the Department of Energy have special responsibilities for their sectors and for cross-sector situations. So I think that, just to recap, knowing the variation of who's good at what in the private sector, don't aim most of your ammunition at people who don't need your help. Pay a lot of attention to small to medium-sized enterprises and to smaller jurisdictions that don't have a lot of organic cybersecurity expertise. Help them as much as you can. Help broker partnerships with private sector expertise in the cyber risk sector, and rinse, repeat. Keep doing that, because the problem doesn't go away just because you addressed it once. I do think there are some institutional or structural things you could do, depending on whether one thinks that there's a national security threat here and takes that seriously. It matters whether you think this is a crime problem, a terrorism problem, or a nation-state geopolitics problem. How you answer that kind of tells you which level of government should have primary responsibility. And, you know, I came into the federal government in 2010. One of the jobs I had was assisting Paul Nakasone and people like that to help set up U.S. Cybercom, because we saw a nation-state threat as being significant. We wrote military doctrines because we thought nation-state threats were serious. And we also worried about the kind of skills and workforce you would need to be able to defend the country, because the problem wasn't going away anytime soon. So that, the NICE framework and others, which create curriculum to train people so that they can take a role in defending critical infrastructures, and all those other smaller entities that need assistance as well. So I think that's what an approach can be. It's not simple and it's not cheap, but it's a lot cheaper than leaving yourself defenseless.
Thank you for sharing, David. Jeff, from your point of view, what can Congress and the administration do to improve cybersecurity within the private sector?
Well, as one of the people sitting here who hasn't worked for CISA, I will ironically maybe be the first one to generally cheerlead for CISA. For anyone who, just to remind, it's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, was created, I believe, during the first Trump administration, but has continued to grow since then, and they do a lot of things. They have sector risk management agencies who focus on individual parts of the economy that face elevated risk. We've talked about finance, healthcare, utilities. And when you see, those impacts for many years, companies were afraid to share information openly, and some still are, about the cyber incidents and threats that they face. Maybe they're worried about reputational risk. Maybe they feel that they have a fiduciary duty not to disclose because they feel that it would do harm to their reputation. CISA has done a lot of good work over the years to build those trusting relationships, to help with sharing information, to help with sharing technical best practices, not only for large organizations, but even for small and medium enterprises. They've put out toolkits for individuals. They've done a lot to help with that collaboration. In the prior administration, CISA did some things in the information space related to elections. That has since become very highly politicized. But I would just, maybe restate here that that's only a very small portion of what CISA does. Even then, if you split, and even then, you can then split the information side from the election system side. I was recently speaking with a Republican member of Congress, for example, who used to have statewide authority in their state for election systems, who was talking about how useful CISA was in securing those systems. So one thing that I would recommend would be to maybe clarify the thinking about some of the ways that CISA is being criticized. Of course, it's a free country. We can have our opinions. That's great. But I would just be careful not to overinflate how much of CISA's operations are actually reflected by those things that they're under attack for, and not overcorrect by overcutting CISA's ability to actually defend us from the threats that we face. Or actually not defend us, but help us defend ourselves, because CISA also doesn't have regulatory authority. A lot of what they do is they build these relationships with people who can voluntarily accept their advice and collaborate. And that's also really, really important to note.
Thank you, Jeff. And as a former CISA employee, thank you again. David, this next question is for you. What changes in policy do you think are necessary to enhance U.S. capabilities to fight and win in cyberspace?
So I think that, my answer to this is predictable given how I've sounded today. I mean, I think that we have a national security issue that we're dealing with, and that means that the federal government needs to step up. It needs to step up and help people defend themselves from a threat that individually we can't deal with. CISA has a role as the civilian national coordinator for cybersecurity and infrastructure resilience. It doesn't have the only role. There are 7 sector risk management agencies like the Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, Education, and others, each of which have some responsibility for managing cyber risks within their domain. CISA is a coordinator. It coordinates those efforts to make sure that you've got a coherent whole in the cross-infrastructure space where infrastructures are interdependent with each other. So it's important that that be a coherent and well-coordinated activity. CISA has done that since 2018, certainly, and prior to that under a different name. I think the military or defense side of this needs to be put on the table plainly, because most people think that national defense is the job of the Department of Defense. I happen to agree with that. That's why we created Cyber Command. It's why we have National Cyber Mission Force element. It's why we have special service elements in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard charged with defending proactively critical infrastructure that's important to military missions and defense missions. What's the most fundamental defense mission? Defending the country from foreign predation, I suppose, and that's how I'd characterize PRC campaigns against U.S. critical infrastructure. Again, Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon, publicly identified by the United States and 4 of its principal colleagues or allies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, identifying perpetrators, identifying their tactics, techniques, and procedures, and identifying what they want to do at a time of their choosing. That is a defense challenge, not just an espionage challenge. There is a contingent ability to disrupt key infrastructure that the PRC is trying to establish and trying to advance. That is a military threat to this country and needs to be treated as such. The threat has granularity to it, and the threat looks one way in the electric sector and another way in the telecom sector, and another way in the water and wastewater treatment sector, and another way in the pipeline sector. Knitting that together requires civilian and defense collaboration on a really close and integrated way, so you can have the best of private sector skills and investments coordinated with the best of public sector and intelligence insight so that you are effective against a threat that is not getting smaller. I got a draft op-ed that I forced Aaron to read a few weeks ago that talks about an integrated way of approaching this that models off of a Navy program actually called Project Overmatch. I like that because it talks about coordinating sensing in critical infrastructure with proactive implementation of something called the Defend Forward strategy that DoD launched a few years ago. It's proactive because it tries to interdict threats before they hit critical infrastructure. It's sensitive because it takes as a given that the adversaries are already here. And I think that that's the fact, and that's a good fact-based way of responding. I can share in response to a question or two what overmatch means, but basically it means applying artificial intelligence, sensing, and battle management coordination to interdict attackers as they are in flight trying to disrupt your critical infrastructures. That means attackers that try and use the interdependencies of infrastructures to kick over, to attack the weakest, get countered as early as possible in the attack cycle. If we do that, we can stem some of the damage by emulating doctrine and practices from the defense sector into the civilian sector, which is where the threat is going to have its impact. And interestingly, the impacts that touch civilian critical infrastructure touch defense because of how critically interdependent defense missions are on the viability of our critical infrastructure. So that's the approach I want to see. I want to see an approach that is not simple continuity with what we've been doing, because I think this is an emergency.
There are also international norms around military targeting of civilian infrastructure and how that is not something that is good or should be deliberately done. I would argue that the U.S. is more committed to those norms than any of the advanced persistent threat actors that we talked about today. And that's also a really important thing to consider because those norms were reached after World War II and haven't been updated since the internet. Now might not be the best time geopolitically to do that, but it's just worth considering and thinking about.
So on that point, I think the norms are really important because it's not just the U.S., of course, it's the U.S. and its Western allies, which are the chief defenders of those norms. And interestingly, our adversaries are not. And which one of our adversaries is involved in a large European war right now where cyber and physical weapons are being used against a democratic state? How reliable is that partner going to be if you're having diplomatic engagements with them on these norms? I would say that, let's get our house in order. Let's get our Five Eyes Western democracy's house in order in terms of adherence to these cyber and physical norms. And a united front is likely to be more successful than trying to do it individually.
Thank you, gentlemen. Jeff, we've spent a good portion of this panel discussing what the administration and Congress can do to mitigate threats within cybersecurity. What can we do? What can Congress and administration do to help public and private sectors manage risk as it relates to AI?
So I think in the international norms we just mentioned and also in the domestic practices that we just mentioned, for policymakers, there's a push and pull between the carrot and the stick, between what you require with regulation versus what's voluntary. And those are both, mechanisms to look at. Sometimes, government may choose to step in and require things. Sometimes there may be so much chaos out there that industry actually welcomes voluntary standards. So what I would say as an answer to your question is I would stress the importance of voluntary standards. This administration, in Europe, for example, the AI Act has very strict regulations around certain use cases and minimum required steps. This administration has said in particular that it doesn't want to take that approach, that they want to support voluntary standards. I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think every organization that's trying to adopt AI is facing difficult questions about bias, about responsibility, about governance. They're all trying to figure out what does good look like? And they're all answering it in different ways. And that means that if you're a vendor or if you're an innovator, you may get 20 questionnaires from 20 different customers, each of which has 100 different questions. And that makes it difficult for developers as well as for deployers of AI. It creates a lot of friction in the market. So I think there's a lot of support for voluntary standards. One that I would call attention to is the NIST risk management framework. NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, has an AI risk management framework, which is a voluntary framework, which I think is an excellent start and could be built upon. Secretary of Commerce in his confirmation hearing even said that he thinks that voluntary standards in AI are the way to go, similar to how we did in cybersecurity. Specifically, I would say that I think the AI risk management framework at NIST could be built out around testing, evaluation, security, documentation. Additional standards could be added, which are a little bit easier for people to build to. Doing this will also help the U.S. to lead by example, because other organizations and companies around the world may look to voluntary standards in the U.S. and say, oh, well, that was promulgated in the U.S., that was good. In early March, NIST initiated what it called a zero drafts standard process, where they're really starting anew an industry consultation to figure out what those standards look like. I think that's excellent. ServiceNow, we submitted a response to the administration's RFI, or request for information, on their AI action plan, saying that we think voluntary standards are great and that we would like to see that supported in the plan when it comes out in July.
Thank you. John, what else can you share about Green Hills' software best practices in cybersecurity?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, we've always had a practice of building our software from the ground up with security. I've brought here, for example, a book on avionics certification. So we follow Dow A processes, design assurance level A. Done many presentations in the UK. I'm going to Japan next month to talk about this. This is software that's built that has much regression testing. So for example, if you had a kernel size of say 15,000 lines, you're looking at code testing of up to 500,000 lines of code. If you have a multi-core processor in a system and you've had to add some scheduling capability, and your kernel is now 19,000 lines, we've had to see our testing go enormously, pass that up into 5 million lines of test code. That's the type of assurance testing you need to do in the high assurance world. That's the type of testing, that's the type of processes we need to bring to critical infrastructure systems. And how we get there, that's why we're here today, right? So those are the types of practices that we do at Green Hills. I could get into compilers and debuggers and how we mitigate race conditions, but I don't know that this is the audience to go into that level of detail. But, again, it's all about mitigating high threat actors and safeguarding our country.
No, that all sounds fantastic. So for these next two questions, these are directed towards all the speakers on the panel today. For the first one, what specific steps can individuals and families take to protect themselves from cyber threats, especially in the context of increasing online activity? So I'll allow any one of you to kick us off here.
I'll take the easy one because there's a standard thing that always says, which is strengthen your passwords, review, and don't use the same password on more than one application that you use. Use multi-factor or extra-factor authentication for any online transaction. Use software that you have obtained from safe locations, that is from app stores, which actually practice some level of security in terms of validating the authorship of software. Don't click on SMS messages you get that claim that you have a DMV toll that is due, because that's not the way the DMV communicates with you. More seriously, phishing is still there. Phishing enabled by AI is pretty tall order in terms of differentiating a phony message from a real one. Pay attention to what your cyber life is, the kind of applications you use and the kind of services that you use. You're probably better at detecting anomalies in those things than almost anybody else, and we don't yet have generative AI that can do that for you, though we may in a few years. That's where I'll start.
I would say, again, multi-factor authentication is important, and if there are other ways that you can do that, for example, through physical keys that you either have to bring close to your phone or plug into your computer when you log into an account. Google, for example, makes it very easy for any who has a Gmail account, probably everyone here. They make it really easy to sign up for an advanced security program where in order to log into your account, you have to have a physical key that you plug in or that you hold near your phone. And if you use Google to sign into your other applications, then that would go there. You can freeze your credit reports with all 3 bureaus, so that if anyone tries to take out a credit card or a loan in your name, they won't be able to because you've frozen it with the bureaus. And lastly, there are toolkits out there that are useful. CISA puts them out. One organization I'm a fan of is called Secure the Village. If you Google them, you can look at their website. They have toolkits for different types of organizations, for nonprofits and others. And then, of course, I'd be remiss without saying, if you're a company who works, in the kind of enterprise software stack and cloud service providers, talk to ServiceNow, because we do a lot to help organizations put these types of workflows in place to make sure that they can respond to security incidents and proactively patch vulnerabilities.
I don't really have much to add to that. I think that covers it. I mean, stay diligent is obviously one that sums all that up, because you're right, I get these weird texts and I don't click on anything. Nope.
Or if you get a call from a
Find me on
scammer.
Twitter.
Yeah.
Either. You won't find me on any of that stuff.
If you get a call from a scammer, you pick up the phone and waste as much of their time as possible so they can't scam other people.
I should add, there's a great tool that a British cybersecurity company developed, which is a generative AI person headshot of a sort of a nice old lady who will basically talk their ear off and never give them any information. But it's sort of this. This is on Instagram. Take a look. But it is this classic sort of. She will talk for hours while someone's trying to get some information out of her, and she's entirely false, fake. So.
We did, I think, did we say encrypt your password Excel spreadsheet? Did we mention that? Okay, yeah, that's, yeah. for
Password
sure.
vaults. Password vault, don't have it on a notepad you keep in your purse or your wallet or something. Don't do that.
So if I may, before we move on to our next question, I'll add a quick little story here. I don't know if anyone here has ever received a call from like an anonymous number claiming to be Venmo, maybe, and saying, oh, we detected a suspicious transaction on your account. We just sent you a code. Please recite the code to me over the phone. And then the text itself says, please do not share this over the phone. Yeah, so just be mindful of those things. But I think it speaks volumes how something really simple from Venmo, for example, like private sector recognizes there's a lot of scams out there, and they're trying their best to kind of inform customers about those threats. You know, even the simplest things matter, and it goes a long way. So for our next question, again for the group, what are the potential consequences of a cybersecurity knowledge gap for different demographic groups?
I'll say first that one potential consequence might be it's tougher to get a job. Because if you don't have access to, well, let's backtrack. 10 years ago, people used to think that becoming a software engineer was a fast track to a middle-class life because you would get a six-figure salary from middle-range coding skills. And that's probably still true. Anybody think it's going to be true in 5 years, given what generative AI and other code writing algorithms are creating right now? I don't think so. So one thing that those who are less well represented in cyber or IT or code writing or software development skill sets need to do is not have their low levels of participation reinforced by the bar getting higher. So and I think that those efforts to make sure that the cyber workforce is varied and diverse need to be reinforced, that this is not a time to sort of do less. That means from messaging to programs. And I'll just stop there because I'll get myself into trouble. But some of my proudest moments at CISA was when I looked at the people who used to work for me, a few hundred of them, and they really did look like America, just like the Biden-Harris administration used to say we would. And that meant veterans, we were like 47% veterans. Women, African Americans, other ethnic groups, all represented. I'm not sure if it was statistically equivalent to the US population, but you get my point. Everybody needs to participate. And that means if there's disparate access to those skills, to education or to opportunity, that matters. And it changes the way at least the US government appears to its constituents when it doesn't look like them.
Completely agree with that. One of the things that we at ServiceNow do is we partner with universities. We have dozens of university partnerships around the world, where once the partnership is in place with the university, we provide all the curricula for free. That's more oriented towards towards in-demand job skills in those markets than towards personal cybersecurity skills. On the personal vigilance side, coming back to what we said before, we just encourage everyone to remain vigilant, including people who may not necessarily be expecting some type of threat to come in. Social engineering, I'm sure, is a term people have used and read about on the internet. We talked about the human factor earlier. A lot of the outreach that may come in from threat actors can be very, very micro-targeted and very designed to people, including with cultural touchstones and things that take advantage of particular communities, of particular demographics, can be exceptionally targeted. So it's just important for everyone to have their guard up. One classic tell is if someone reaches out with urgency, saying, "Oh, it's important that you do this now," classic red flag. You should think twice before you do whatever they're asking for.
Should I add that threat just on that? Sorry.
No, please.
But, threat actors are smart, and they will optimize deceptive messaging to your community, to a Black American community, to others. Why? Because it works. They'll be more successful if they do that. So being culturally aware of that differential targeting is important for defense. It's important and it's smart. A smarter defender means knowing yourself, knowing your domains in a critical infrastructure sense, knowing the communities that make up the United States' population, and knowing that some of them can be targeted by people who wish them ill, and just being smart about it.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, I know at Green Hills, we do have to, for the type of software we're doing and writing, it's paramount that we weed out any weakest links, right? I mean, that we have the strongest programming capability in-house. In fact, I remember bringing some Pentagon officials out to headquarters, and I always remember a statement that my CEO made about, we have folks that not only write great code, but we actually have folks, we're probably one of the few companies that get paid to take lines of code out of systems, because lines of code is attack surface. So we try to give you the same capability that you may have gotten somewhere else, but make it high assurance, safety critical, security critical, real time, determinism. And whenever someone says real time, if you're ever out in the world and you hear that, remember real time isn't just like time. It means deterministic. It's going to do what it does, and we protect against we protect against the attack vectors out there like malware, nation state, phishing, ransomware, spyware, theft, 0 days. That's the world we live in. So I just wanted to make that point. It's a little bit technical, it's a nuanced, but it's important. Programmers that you got to really guard against insider threats as well out there. So.
Thank you, gentlemen. So that concludes the questions I have for the panel. However, we'd like to open it up to the room. If anyone in the room would have any questions, please raise your hand and we'll have someone from the CHLI team give you a microphone. Please start by introducing yourself, your name, where you're working, interning, and please have a question ready for a specific speaker and not a comment. Right. I guess we're here.
Hi, my name is Megan. I'm with the FIU Fly-In. My question was, how could cybersecurity help with misinformation attacks specifically, and not just infrastructure attacks? And that's for Dr. David.
Thank you for that very on-point question. I would say that my old director, Jenny Easterly, used to say that we were interested in making sure that the American people could live their lives as they chose to live them without us or anybody else interfering. So, factual accuracy was where we used to place our emphasis. Not much more than that, and very, very narrowly since 2020. This is a very fraught issue in the United States because of our constitutional freedoms, freedom of speech being preeminent. And up to now, the federal government's not been able to do much safely that wouldn't look political, to be honest. Other countries have a different approach to this. In a sense, what the federal government can probably do, has done, not always successfully, or has tried to do, is to make sure that when it's foreign malign intent, when we think in other countries trying to manipulate opinions of America, to try and highlight that that's a threat. And trusting that the ecosystem of IT, of social media, and of popular comment will do the rest. The US government has really fine limits on what is acceptable response here. Those limits may change over time, but right now, I think it's fair to say that one of the areas where CIS has been criticized, I don't think appropriately, but doesn't matter what I think, is a suspicion that it's gone too far in that area. So again, I look at other countries have different definitions, especially the European Union in particular, has a different view of the role of the state in protecting what they view as an information space.
Hello, my name is Sarah Skaleski, and I am also with the FIU cohort. I have a question about supply chains. As the world becomes more and more dependent on global supply chains and our critical infrastructure areas rely on those chains, how can we ensure that their security is protected with different regions having different regulations? How can we ensure that our critical infrastructure that relies on these global supply chains remains protected with such a fragmented regulations across borders?
It's
For anyone.
I would say generally, so I don't want to go too deep on just kind of like ServiceNow products here, but one thing that we do sell is third-party risk management. So your ability to connect with a whole bunch of different feeds to take in information and threat intel, map out who all of your suppliers are, see what the associated risk with them is, which is a bit different than when you're running an embedded. It's more on the kind of like commercial supply chain side. But that could be your devices and where they're manufactured. It could be semiconductors, depending on what it is. It could be software. But essentially mapping your supply chain and taking in as many feeds as possible is, I think, important. And then another thing that we talked about was sort of software supply chains and understanding the bill of materials that goes into the software that's running. That's also, I'd say, important as well.
Hi, my name is Chris Ojeda. I'm a recent graduate of an alumni of UC Berkeley and the Global Leaders. My question is particularly for Mr. Warther. Professor Herbert Lin of the Hoover Institute talks about how complexity adds vulnerabilities, and I think this coincides with your comments about taking code out of systems. However, I understand that with the evolution of technology, it's important to innovate. So how do you ensure that you don't add over complexity to your systems?
Yeah, so that is the heart of the issue, right? I mean, I was, and I'm going to answer the question, but I'd like to do examples. You know, I was with the Ground Army last year, and we were having a conversation about the complexity of next generation silicon, right? So, 25 years ago, we would have what's called a board support package, which is mapping your software onto a board that is in a device, encryptor or software-defined radio. So, it's really important that you have the ability to partition your software so that you can understand what components are truly high assured safety critical, because maybe not everything's going to have that level of testing I spoke about earlier. So parsing, partitioning your load, if you will, onto these devices becomes very important. So you need good system architects. Obviously, you're always going to need strong programmers, but that is a big part of the issues. How am I going to do my information flow controls? How will I look at my software architecture across the entire device, then the device drivers? I don't want to go too deep, but I get into conversations with unmanned aerial systems on asymmetric I/O. How do we feed that I/O into the computer? So I'll stick with the parsing answer for now. I hope does that answer your question a bit? Okay, good.
And also to both questions, just really quick. So if, let's say, a vulnerability becomes known, it's published, it's a known exploited vulnerability, then if you're an organization, you need to map your surface, see what the corrective steps are, take those steps, and hear back. Well, a big part of, shortening that flow is really important. If in your security operations center you have swivel chairs where people are going from system to system, you're probably losing time. There's a big drive in the federal government to automate that. The FedRAMP program, which is the federal cloud security standard, they're working to try to automate that now. It raises difficult questions about what that tooling will look like. But one thing that I would just say that I think is really important here to come back to standards is that NIST is developing a standard called OSCAL. It's the Open Security Control Assessment Language, or OSCAL, and the goal is to automate that machine-to-machine communication about those compliance steps. So machine one says to machine two, hey, are you vulnerable? Yes. Have you taken the steps? What are they? And I think that's a really important standard if we're going to be able to kind of build this design space for improving resilience and response to threats as they become known.
Hi, my name is Catherine. I'm also with the Flying Seminar, and my question is for Dr. Mussington. So I think that we can see a geopolitical alignment going on between the Russian Federation, Iran, North Korea, and China. And I know that these groups have proliferated groups that carry out cyber offensive attacks, specifically to undermine Western influence or to finance their regimes. So I wanted to know, how do these developments factor into creating resilience in our critical infrastructure?
First, thanks for the question. I mean, I think that, first of all, they make us prioritize resilience as a policy objective. The challenge is that if you take the threat as seriously as you've just outlined, the demand signal is on us to do something about it. The federal government, our private sector partners, to do something about it. That most likely means legislation, and it most likely means dollars. So you can probably measure the efficacy of a response by what is the cybersecurity budget of the United States government directed at critical infrastructure? And how has the Congress evaluated that, seen whether it's sufficient or not? What risks have been mitigated in the last 3 or 4 years? Are we, metrics for improvement, all those program things that we don't actually have very many of for critical infrastructure cybersecurity. So, we have frameworks, and the risk management framework's been mentioned, and this cybersecurity framework's another one. DoD has its own frameworks. We used to have something called the Cyber Safety Review Board, all of which were somewhat stovepiped attempts to provide data and strategic guidance on how to improve cyber risk management against nation-state threats and other threats. It's a bit thin on the ground when it comes to proof that what we're doing is working. That's the challenge. And I'm hoping the new administration is going to make progress there, because actual actions that provably reduce risks is probably where we need to be right now.
On that, my name is Janice. On that note about reducing risk, I wonder how far, for those of you, anyone, the experts, aviation security, to me, I feel pretty, in spite of all the accidents recently, I feel pretty confident when I step on a plane that it's not going to be hacked, that we're going to take off, assuming everything's under control, no hijackers or anything, that the technology is going to work. I don't feel as secure in autonomous vehicles, for example, especially the non-regulated ones, any more that I feel that if the critical infrastructure people running the system where I live are using it in non-military grade software that is totally hackable. Like 0 Days, a show on Netflix recently that got a lot of attention because of maybe it overplayed the drama of being hacked in all the systems in critical infrastructure, but I don't know that it's 100% fantasy, even if that expressed it at the X factor nonstop, right? So a lot of young people here today, I know we have a lot of polarization in government, which is not conducive to getting a lot of work done in terms of policy, and it sounds like feels like we're very far from feeling that the same aviation security guidelines and standards could be applicable to any of the systems that are able to be hacked easily. So how far are we from being a little safer? Because it doesn't sound, anything I've heard here, nothing makes me feel like we're actually safe.
Well, there was a question about...
In a bad note.
I mean, well...
Well, I'll make mine really quick. So, you brought up a couple good points there. I'm thinking about independent review. The FAA, yes, it's a regulatory agency, but we, as I mentioned earlier, those planes don't fly if there's a problem, right? Because we've decided as a society that if something's not going right, I'm not getting on the airplane. It's all about trust, right? The industry has to maintain trust, or you're getting in a train or something. You're not going to get on the airplane. So that industry has to have trust. I'm not doing so much. I'm so focused on defense that in the area of industrial control, I don't know how independent review is conducted for software when it's deployed into New York City for the sewer system. When if all the toilets don't flush, and there's going to be a big problem in New York City, right? So those are the things that the industry has to grapple with a little bit as well. It's to build that trust.
I'd say that the FAA has really talented people working at AIT, which is its technology division, and they, like other federal agencies, have a big job because there are a lot of applications in that environment. Across the federal government, most agencies have thousands of applications, and here, by application, I mean a hardware-software combination that was set up for a particular purpose at a particular time. And at the FAA, for example, people remember the NOTAM outage. It was one system that ended up, pilots couldn't get the information they needed to take off. Well, there were a lot of hearings on that, and they ended up getting tens of millions of dollars to fix that application. The FAA has, I would say, hundreds and hundreds of applications. That's just one. So I think it's important to empower them to take a holistic look across the environment, its implications, see which ones make sense, which ones may not, which ones could be updated and how. And just to keep at it. And one last thing I'd say would be on the vendor side, when you are then taking these steps and modernizing these things, it's really important to know what the outcome is, to not just throw money at the problem, but ideally to have a fixed price, fixed term, outcome-based model where you know exactly what the end state is you're pushing for, so you don't spin your wheels and end up with projects that are over budget by tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars.
Not to be Johnny One Note on this, but I think that risk is something we live with. In the aviation example, we have decades of security engineering and safety engineering that's produced real risk reduction, measurably proven risk reduction, and we have a tolerance in the society that requires that risk reduction. If the FAA and aviation are the sort of gold standard for this sort of system risk management, everywhere isn't like the FAA. And some of the critical infrastructures that are being victimized are not like the FAA. They're not like aviation, they're not like energy, they're not like defense. And we have a different risk tolerance as a society. We have accepted lower levels of preparedness because we didn't think the threat warranted anything else. I think the fact is that times change and we need to get more like the FAA and more like aviation. But that's going to be expensive. And the who pays question always appears. Is that the taxpayer? Is that the private sector? Is it, who pays for that? So in terms of safety, I'm not a safety specialist per se, so I'll sort of duck that question and say that in terms of risk management, we need to do better. And if we don't do better, we'll have outcomes that we don't want. That means choosing to take decisions mindful of what the real risks are, not what the rhetoric about risks is. So if someone tells you that Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon, that would be me, from the People's Republic of China are strategic threats to U.S. critical infrastructure. And if we care about things like Taiwan in 2027, or we care about what happens to Ukraine, or we care about all of these incidents where critical infrastructures are being disrupted and destroyed, we should reflect on what it would be like to live under those conditions here. If we have fragile critical infrastructures that aren't up to an aviation standard of protection, that should make us decide to do more in sort of peacetime. And if it doesn't, then we're accepting those risks. And that's, as long as you have your eyes open when you're accepting risks, I guess that's as much as you can expect. I think that we need to do a lot more, and we need to have some urgency about it to reach that aviation standard that I agree is probably the best we have.
Hi, my name is Archer Amen. I'm also a participant of the FIU Fly-In. My question's for Jeff Browning. So during your panel, you mentioned both imposing better voluntary standards for tech companies in security, as well as supporting public education. My question is, where we've seen certain examples in which certain companies have maybe tried to obscure their security practices deliberately from the general public, considering things like how terms and conditions are often structured to be in very small font, unreadable, where it seems like it's not geared for the average consumer. And I know legislation has been pushed sometimes in the US and sometimes in other countries to try and advocate for better voluntary transparency of these standards to support public education around security. What would you say is the role that civil society can play, and how can we support the development of better voluntary standards that empower public citizens to understand their own security risks and what may be happening with their data?
I am so glad you asked that question. So I spent a lot of time working on federal education policy, and I became very deeply convinced that critical thinking should be. Now, the federal government until recently wasn't dictating local curriculum standards. We're maybe up for a shift in that, I guess. But the ability to seek and differentiate between opposing sources is something I think at the individual level we've lost. I think people don't necessarily go and differentiate between those sources. In the case of privacy, so the company I work for is a B2B company, not a B2C company. A lot of the legislative activity and conversations that are happening here are around B2C and around consumer privacy, so may not be the best person to weigh in. I would say, though, even going to schools, like the primary law for student data privacy in the U.S. predates the internet. And in a lot of cases, these are really difficult conversations to have. Congress hasn't, been able to come up with a clear framework going forward. So I think coming from the congressional angle, that would be the question: is what would that look like? We saw Europe kind of take the lead. Maybe Europe was a little bit freer to do so in the case of GDPR, and then again in the AI Act. We haven't necessarily seen that here, but we'll see where those conversations go. And then, I think at the individual level, equipping people with the skills and tools that they need to understand that. For example, to decide before you click a box, is that an issue? If you see something, there's a question about misinformation earlier. I mean, a lot of people may not even necessarily have the media literacy to know the difference between an opinion or a news coverage piece, to be familiar with internationally recognized journalistic standards, with what it means to read something from a journalist who's corroborated multiple sources versus someone who's publishing an opinion. So I'm getting pretty outside my core wheelhouse of cybersecurity issues here, but I am very passionate about the issues you asked about, and I'm glad you asked that question.
Yeah, and to just jump on that a little bit, if you look at some license agreements out there, they may say in there, not meant for mission-critical applications, right? So what's a mission-critical application? And certainly many of these critical infrastructure SCADA systems are absolutely mission-critical. And so if the vendor that's producing that equipment is willing to take that risk, and put something that's not meant for mission and not pay for good, high-assured software, I throw my hands up. I've been doing this 25 years, trying to convince companies to spend the money. We're on a continuing resolution right now, and I worry about that because new program starts aren't happening, and those that are trying to spend to the level from last year that were just entering the phase of doing their high assurance software, they're locked right now, with some of this. So these are the types of issues that come up that impact all of us in this room.
On the consumer privacy point, one last thing I'd say would be our CEO, Bill McDermott, often says that trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets, and I think that's definitely true. And at ServiceNow, we are responsible for a lot of customers' data, and what you do on our platform belongs to you. So that may differentiate us from some others who use that data in order to sell it to data brokers. That's not the business that we're in.
All right. Well, I believe that concludes our portion of Q&A from the audience. I'd like to thank our panelists here today. If you would all join me in a round of applause for them.
Another round of applause for Aaron. Thank you so much. Very much appreciate it. I'm going to pass the baton back here to our host. But before I do, I want to acknowledge two people that I didn't get a chance to say hello to when we first started. One is two of our advisory council members, Nora Venegas with Tyson Foods. Thank you, Nora, for being here. And Mark Williams from Fairrock Strategies. Thank you. I also see Ryan from Capital One. Thank you very much for being here. It's important to recognize the leadership that makes a lot of these programs happen. They also support interns, our Global Leaders interns, and if I could have the interns raise your hands. Global Leaders interns, raise your hands. So if you're interested in the leadership program, please ask one of the students here, or Nicole Marin, raise your hand in the back of the room. She can also share a little bit more information. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Carlos before we wrap up. Carlos?
And really, just for the close act, it's an honor to have another one of our amazing faculty members here that is a cybersecurity expert in our College of Engineering and Computing. I'll let him cover a little bit about, in a few minutes, because we know we're the last step before our amazing reception, what work he's leading at the College of Engineering and Computing and some of his colleagues. In addition to the work he's leading, he is also part of a larger group. Since we did touch on education, and even though at the local level, FIU has been pleased to help NIST coordinate the National Institute for Cybersecurity Education over the last 5, 6 or so years. But let me quickly introduce Selçuk Uluguak.
Thank you, thank you. Hello, everyone. Sorry, I had a busy day today. So I'm a professor at Florida International University in the College of Engineering and Computing. My research is in cybersecurity, IoT security, smart system security. We had so many great colleagues. We have so many great colleagues. Is this okay? Okay. We are very active in not only in the nation, in the world. I can give you some numbers that we brought more than just over. I think last time we were counting more than $25 million in research dollars from different federal, state, and other industry. We are extremely collaborating on open for collaborations at every level. We had grants from the government that help the government workforce. CyberCore Scholarship for Service, for example. We've been collaborating with DHS and NSF, and I'm also on loan at the moment for a year at National Science Foundation as a program director. But here I'm in my university capacity, not my NSF capacity. Cybersecurity, cybersecurity is a very important area at every level, like my colleagues here basically talked about, and. There are so many opportunities. There are so many also, I would say, challenges. We are looking at from the technical perspective. There are so many problems from ransomware to how you can today in the olden days, for example, you would download a file and you would be infected with a malware, a virus. But today even the bad guys would trick you to upload files and then get into your computer easily. So it's a very interesting ecosystem, and so. With the Bitcoin, with the cryptocurrencies, with the cryptojacking, so illegal, Bitcoin mining, so you name it. We have so many data servers, but they, or your computer, you think that it might be slow running, but in fact, it might be doing an illegal crypto mining operation without you even noticing it, basically. So the threat is always evolving, and at FIU, we are ahead of it with our colleagues. We have a new center called CERTA. It's a cybersecurity, privacy, and education center. We have about 20 active, faculty there, actively doing research. So I don't want to take too much of your time, but I'm here to also mingle with you, meet with you, and also, if you have any questions about our studies in cybersecurity and privacy, I'd be happy to, give you more information or refer you to the right resource. And thank you for being here. And FIU DC is an amazing place. I'm always diving, and they're organizing really great events. And I'm really happy to be part of this great institution. It's been 10 plus years for me, and it's counting. I've, trained 70 plus students as PhDs and masters and some undergrads and high schools even in my lab. We are open always for collaboration, and it's, as it says, Florida Impact University. So we are here for impact, and great to be talking to you later. And yeah.
So I just want to say thank you again for joining us. These are the discussions that are really important, not just because we have the experts here to kind of share with us what's going on, what are some recommendations from a policy standpoint, both on the administration side and in Congress. But the other piece that I always share with everyone is that we're very blessed to have the opportunity to be here in person to have these conversations. We do have people that have joined us live stream, and we record it so that people can listen to this later. But part of the work is once like I guess from a teacher standpoint, right? Once you have the information and you can't unlearn it. You can't unknow it. And so part of it is that now that you have more information, you have experts that you can access, please take the time to educate other people, especially in our communities. You know, my mom, for example, she barely knows what to do with the cell phone. We had to program certain names in there. She doesn't answer the landline anymore because she doesn't know if somebody is going to try to get information from her. She's also, you know, been an advocate for others in the family, like don't answer the phone. I mean, it's just kind of crazy what's out there, but it's those kinds of situations that people in our families and our communities are very, very vulnerable. And so please take the time when you can to educate them and encourage them what to do, because they're the ones that, you know, when something really bad happens, you know, we're the ones that are going to get the phone calls and say, Mija, somebody called and I gave them this information. I'm like, oh my God. So please take the time to teach others what you have learned today. And with that, God bless. And for those of you here, I hope you can stay and join us for a reception. Thank you again to FIU.